Hey guys, it's Standing for Truth coming to you tonight. I've got some good people here with me. I've got Jeremy, Neph, Immutable, and Crispr. We're going to have some good discussion, some good dialogue here on some interesting topics. We're going to change it up a bit, I think, and start off with a bit of a dialogue on the global flood, evidence for and evidence against. And then I'm sure it'll get into something more evolution related. And who knows from there? It'll probably be a free for all. But first off, I'll introduce Neph, who will be defending, obviously, creation and the flood. And then Immutable, who's going to kind of give his feedback here on the flood and what he disagrees with it. You want to kind of give a few words there, Neph, and then we'll let Immutable say a few words, and then we'll just kind of go back and forth that way. I'll certainly be kind of moderating. Hopefully it's just free flowing, no interruptions, but if we have to, we're going to mute Superbad there real quick. So Superbad, make sure if you do need to talk after, just unmute yourself. But all that being said, guys, Neph, say a few words. We'll go with Immutable and we'll go from there.
Okay. I go by NephilimFree on YouTube. I've had a YouTube channel since 2007. I do Christian apologetics, creation apologetics. Young Earth Creationist Christian. I became a Young Earth Creationist because of science, not because of the Bible. Although Scripture is per my Christian beliefs, I believe Scripture espouses young Earth creation, and I believe that's sufficient reason to believe it because I believe the Bible is God's inspired word. But I became a creationist and a young Earth creationist, in fact, because of by studying the scientific evidence for and against the subjects related to creation and evolution.
Okay, thanks, Neph. Go ahead there, Immutable.
Sure. Hey, my name's Immutable. I just chill on the internet, occasionally talk to people. That's all.
Awesome. You know what, Neph, if you want to give a brief, maybe 1 minute explanation on why you think a global flood, fits the empirical evidence that we see. And that being said, why a biblical model is certainly a better explanation than, say, the uniformitarian base model and evolution. And then we'll switch over to Immutable and see what kind of problems he has with that. Go ahead, Neph.
Okay, well, I would say there's more physical evidence for the flood of Noah than there is for anything else in all of science. There are a very great many features of the geomorphology of the Earth that can't be explained by uniformitarianism, but scream of a global catastrophe. The mountains of the Earth are deformed by deformed strata. The fossil record is a record of the rapid burial of billions of creatures buried alive, which can't have taken place over a vast geologic age. Nearly complete absence of grass and soil in the geologic column. The strata have fine distinct boundaries between one another instead of grading. The absence of erosion between the strata of the Earth. Sand dunes formed underwater, which with a 15-degree angle of inclination, which verifies they were formed underwater instead of by aeolian process. Drop stones sealed in mountains, which strata formed around, proving they were moved there by rapidly moving water and sealed and buried then and covered with sedimentary strata, which were deposited by water. Vast areas of flat plains on the continents called planation surfaces, which can't be explained by anything but massive sheets of water moving rapidly across the continent at the end stage of the Noachian flood. The 5 major mega sequences that exist can't be explained by anything but rapid inundation, and the list goes on and on and on. So I believe the features of the Earth tell us unequivocally of the global Noachic flood.
Well, thank you there, Neph. Immutable, if you want to kind of go ahead there, take your time, tell us what you disagree in regards to what Neph said, and then we'll just kind of go with a free-flowing dialogue from there.
Sure. I mean, I think it's obvious from if anybody has read the Bible before, that the flood is referring to as a local flood. Most importantly, what's noted is that the numerical kind of system they use is far different from our own. If you compute the math, it turns out it's about the size of a small yacht, so they can only fit in certain kinds of animals. Regarding geology, it makes sense that millions of years ago, if you take that to be true, that you can have sedimentation via plate tectonics, via the fact that erosion does occur. It eventually takes care of mountains and has deposition. We know how mountains form. We know that there's certain kinds of soil deposition which are specific to different processes, such as volcanic eruptions, shifting of certain plates, causing uplift within certain regions of geology. If you take the flood to be true and happening almost instantaneously, you run into the issue that the salinity levels would have risen and immediately wiping out a very large majority of species that only live in particularly glacial areas. There's a lot of other issues too. We know that a lot of floods are documented in world history. None of them seems to be occurring as a global flood. The flood of Noah is very similar to that of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and that's where it seems to be inspired from. And you can see quite a lot of similarities between that and their mythology in general. Furthermore, if you study trees, the study of dendrochronology, you find that, in fact, there doesn't seem to be any consistency with all the trees being flooded at one point or another. As if it were, you would have seen that in the different roots. When different roots are flooded with water, based upon the composition of based upon the acidity or basicity of the water, you'll see different patterns emerging with how far the tree rings expand outward and how far they contract, and you don't see that throughout the global flood.
Okay, well, it's a free-flowing dialogue at this point, Neff, so you can kind of go from there. And then if I hear any, obviously, interruptions, any need for me stepping in and moderating, I'll do so, but I don't suspect I will have to. Go ahead, Neff.
Okay. Well, as for the flood being local in the Bible possesses a number of statements which tell us unequivocally the flood was global. It says that every creature on the whole surface of the earth died. Now, that wouldn't be true if the flood was local. It says also that under every creature under the whole heaven perished. All the land on the earth that was under the whole heaven was inundated. Now, the whole heaven means the whole atmosphere. The Bible describes three heavens. The first is the atmosphere. The Bible says the birds of heaven. That's implying, of course, obviously referring to the atmosphere. The Bible then describes outer space as a heaven. It says, the stars of heaven. So that's the second heaven. And the third heaven is that the Bible refers to as the abode, the immaterial, infinite abode of God, whatever that is. A human being can truly comprehend what that is. But the first heaven is the atmosphere of the earth. So when the Bible is referring to a geologic event, it's correct in referring to not outer space, it's referring to the atmosphere. So everything that was under the whole heaven was destroyed by the flood. If the whole heaven is the atmosphere of the earth was covered globally. It says also that the water exceeded, I think it was 15 cubits above the highest mountains of the earth. That means if that takes place, the whole earth is flooded. So the Bible absolutely tells us of a global event. It even tells us in the book of Job chapter 38, that the mountains of the earth were rolled and folded, and the ice age was created by the flood. That wouldn't have happened with a local event. Now, as for being borrowed from the Babylonian flood account,
I'm going to have to interrupt you because I want to respond to your point.
Well, let me finish with the Babylonian thing, and then you're welcome to. The Babylonian account is a local flood. A man riding a square barge down a river. It doesn't make sense because God could have told him just, move. Why would he get 2 of every kind of creature on the earth onto a barge, ride down the river 5 or 10 miles, and get off? That doesn't even make sense. So it's not plausible that the flood account in the Bible was borrowed from the Babylonian. What the truth of it is, the Babylonians knew about it because everybody from the Tower of Babel affair onward understood that what had happened on the earth before the Tower of Babel affair.
I mean, okay, that's inconsistent because the Epic of Gilgamesh is documented before the Noachian flood. The other issue is that if you're going to try and make the argument that it just ran to the whole atmosphere, then number one, there's the issue of there's not enough water on the planet to accommodate that need. The other issue is that by the understanding of cosmic geography that a lot of scholars have done, they're most likely referring to the mountains that surrounded them and the geography local to them. It's fairly obvious to people that have studied it that they weren't familiar with the rest of the planet that surrounded them. They were familiar with quite a bit. They knew about neighboring areas like the Sumerians and Babylonians and things like that. That's made very clear, but the whole earth around them they weren't familiar with. So I don't think it can be really made for the argument that it's the whole earth that's being covered.
Well, the Babylonian account was actually written 3 centuries after the book of Genesis. The Epic of Gilgamesh that you speak of was written about 1100 BC. The book of Genesis was written 1400 to 1450 BC. But now, it wouldn't matter if the Epic of Gilgamesh was actually older than book of Genesis. That doesn't mean it's referring that the event it's referring to is older. That's just when it was penned down. I mean, so that okay. Doesn't tell us, that doesn't really make a case either way for.
But I mean, we can agree though, right? If that's the case, if they're describing the same event, that means the flood must have happened throughout 300, 400 years ago, or 300 to 400 years in length. That the flood was continuous over that time span.
No, the Bible doesn't tell us that. It tells us that Noah and his family remained on the ark for a period of 1 year after the flood came to an end, and the waters receded from the earth over that 1 year period. It's likely that God commanded them to stay on the ark for a year. This would give a full season for plants, shrubs, vines, fruit bearing bushes and grass to grow up again on the earth, so that when the animals got off, they would have something to eat.
I suppose. I mean, I just still don't see why the Bible would necessarily consider itself to be talking about a global flood. I mean, you don't have enough water, and it seems perfectly natural that if you consider the perspective of Jewish people living in a land and they know that it's about to be flooded, that they have to move and they have to migrate somewhere else in order to survive, and they have to take one of each stock, or however much is required, or however much is documented according to the Bible.
I don't think you've actually read what the Bible says about the flood. Let me share a couple of passages with you that make the case. Genesis 6:12, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, and all flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. And God said unto Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, and the earth was filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. The whole, all flesh. That means
sure. So it's
the Bible describes anything with flesh as being a creature which has blood or breath or both. So that means a cricket is flesh. Plants are never described as having flesh. And so this implies, of course, a global event. Now, 2 Peter 2:4 is the New Testament, and it tells us the same thing. It says, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah and 8 persons. So if only 8 were saved, that means everybody else died. And so that also implies a global flood. But Genesis 7:19 says, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits did the waters above prevail, and the waters were, and the mountains were covered, and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both fowl and cattle and beast, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, and all that was in the dry land died, and every living substance was destroyed, which was upon the face of the ground, both man cattle, creeping things, and fowl of heaven. They were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and there were 8 with him, and they went with him in the ark. So that is absolutely clear as a bell, that everything that was on the earth died except Noah and the animals and his family and the animals in the ark. Now,
Great.
that could only happen with a global flood.
Great. So, I mean, long story short, the summary can be described in 2 sentences. Flood destroys things. Very few things survive. People move on. Great. I mean, once again, it can be referring to their genealogy, or you can take it to be literal. I mean, quite obviously, they're referring to the context of God as, well, not God, but the context of the world as the world that they know.
No, I don't see how that's possible, because it tells us that every high mountain on the earth, every creature that creeped on the earth, and everything that was under the whole heaven perished, all flesh.
Sure,
So
I mean, there are mountains in the Middle East, right?
Everything.
Well, sure, there's mountains in the Middle East. We know that. I mean, that's not horribly uncommon. It's not uncommon that people that live in mountainous terrains reconcile the fact that, hey, there's mountains. Hey, there's things that live in mountains. There's armadillos. There's crickets. There's all sorts of wild crap.
Well,
I don't see that as being fantastically a stupendous observation on their part.
Yeah, I think the context is abundantly clear. The New Testament backs up that it was global also. 2 Peter 2:4 it says that only Noah and them with him on the ark were spared. Jesus Christ said the same thing. He said, referring to the flood, like his return, everything in all of creation will be subject to him when he returns. And he said, Jesus Christ said, that they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, and the flood came and took them all away, all. So because the context here, see, the context is he's talking about his return, and he says, but as it was in the days of Noah, so it shall be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, so what happens when he returns is like what happened with the flood. What happens when he returns is all of creation, every living thing will be subject to him on the whole earth, not a local land, but the whole earth. Okay, that's the context. So when he uses the flood of Noah and says all life perished, they all died, it's a global event because of the context of what Jesus said.
Once again, though, I mean, in the context of both the Old and New Testament, the context of earth that they're using is quite very easily known to be local. I mean, I don't think that people in the Middle East knew about the North Americas or Australia or things like that.
When the hell we go live?
Well,
So
how could it be local if the Bible says everything that was under the whole heaven? That means the whole atmosphere.
It means under the observable sky, right?
It doesn't say those words, though. It doesn't say under the observable. It says whole heaven. I mean, are you saying...
Right. So...
Right.
Okay, so I think at this point... Okay, actually, I'll let Immutable finish his point there. And then it sounds like, obviously, we're going to have to agree to disagree on what the Bible teaches in regards to either it being a local or a global flood. And then hopefully we can get into maybe what Immutable Destiny disagrees in regards to, say, the geological evidence that Neph provided in his 1-minute opening. Go ahead, Immutable.
Yeah, I mean, that can be explained if you consider the fact that, number one, the Bible clearly teaches that the earth is flat. And part of their envisionment of the flat earth is that there are 4 essentially quadrants of the earth, and that if you pay attention to it, that these 4 quadrants of the earth are unique. And if they're only familiar with one quadrant of the earth, well, that one quadrant that gets flooded is referring to them specifically. And yes, the Bible does teach a flat earth.
Okay, Neff, did you want to respond to his flat earth claim and then proceed from there at maybe providing a couple of your best evidence for a global flood in obviously the observable record we see, and then we'll allow Immutable to go from there.
Okay. Well, The Bible in no way teaches a flat earth. In fact, it tells us in one passage unequivocally the earth is round. It tells us that there'll be two working in a field and one taken, two women grinding at a mill, of course, and one taken, two men sleeping in a bed and one taken. Women work at wells in the daylight. They don't do it at night. They bring their water in before the sun goes down. Men sleep in a bed at night, typically, and men work in the field, not at night, but in the daylight when they can see what they're doing. So this is referring to an event which took place on the dark and light sides of the earth. When Christ comes, all will be called and answer to him on the day that he returns. And that will be a global event because it refers to people being taken from the earth in the dark and light sides of the earth. That wouldn't be true for the flat earth. For the earth to be flat, and that to be so, then would have to be cultures of people living on both sides of the earth that never met each other, never knew about each other. And to save both, Jesus Christ would have to be crucified twice on both sides of the flat earth. So none of that is plausible. Now, as for evidence for the flood of Noah, I think the most obvious evidence for the flood of Noah is this geologic column. The earth is covered with an average, according to Professor Paul Nelson, Stephen Nelson, I think it is, and numerous other scientists, that the earth is covered with an average of 1,800 meters of sedimentary strata deposited by moving water. And these strata are sedimentary materials that were laid down by moving water, which sorts materials automatically, hydrologically sorts materials, and deposits different types of material based on their density. And it also sorts them by particle size. It's called particle distribution. And that only happens underwater. So the whole geologic column was formed underwater. Even geology experts agree that the vast majority, at least, of strata on the earth were formed underwater. So the way that they explain this away is not a global flood, is by saying each individual strata was, of course, at some point laid down and then became the surface of the earth for some extended period of time. And then another strata is deposited, 1,000 years later, 5,000 years later, 15,000 years later, like that. And to build up the geologic column, you have to ask yourself, where did it come from? How does local floods, countless local floods, slowly build all of the continents up to a height of 1,800 meters? Where'd the materials come from?
I don't think people
that
are.
doesn't make sense, So. And one more thing, and then the thing that really is a killer about the strata is that the absence of erosion between them. They're laid down like pancakes directly on top of one another. The boundary between them is paper thin in most cases. That means there's no erosion between them. They don't gradiate, one material gradiating into a different strata above it, and so on and so on and so on. They have fine, distinct boundaries, sometimes paper thin. There's no erosion. If any one of those strata were ever the surface of the earth for 100 years, much less 5,000, there would be dramatic surface erosion, and the next strata would be buried on top of a rough, highly eroded surface. We don't see that through the whole geologic column. That's because they were laid down rapidly together. None of those strata could have ever been the surface of the earth for any extended period of time.
I don't see why that's the case. I mean,
I just told you about it.
So what do other scientists who specialize in this particular field say about that? Because I don't think they're saying that it's that hydrologic sorting alone is the thing that's creating these columns. I think most people are probably making the argument that the activity of plate tectonics is what's responsible for the laying down of different sedimentation and the different layers that we observe. I don't think they're arguing that the fact that massive bodies of water are causing these layers to occur. And I don't know why you would expect erosion to occur with a layer that's being set down and then being allowed to cool for some thousands of periods of time.
Well, in the 1940s, 50s, and before, geologists largely believed, it takes evolutionists decades to come around to a particular discovery. And the idea that the strata of the earth were deposited by wind was posited many decades before the 1940s, 50s. But in the 50s, a paradigm shift took place, and scientists began to accept that the strata of the earth were not deposited by, the vast majority of them, were not deposited by wind. because that was an insufficient mechanism to explain them. They accepted at that point that that virtually all the strata in the earth were deposited underwater. Their explanation for that is that the continents rose and sank incrementally in different portions over time, and that's how they all became covered with deep sediment. So since at least the 1950s, secular geologists universally agree that the vast majority of strata in the whole geologic column were indeed deposited by water. Okay, so and one of the things that caused that paradigm shift was fossils. They realized that if a creature can't fall dead in a dry environment and be buried ever so slowly by materials left by wind, and you'll get a fossil, it takes highly mineralized water in sediments that cover the creature and seal it up quickly to make a fossil. That was the kicker that changed the paradigm. And so secular geologists acknowledge today that the geologic column represents a watery event, but they just have a different explanation for it.
You know, if I wanted to take a history of science course, I would do that. But the plate tectonics thing I'm talking about, I believe it arose in the 1970s or 1980s. So the 1940s or 1950s seemed a little bit out of date for an explanation, given that, 30, 40 years passed by, and even that's probably been revised a little bit to ground itself in what we know nowadays. So if your argument is that in the 1940s and 50s they thought this, and that seems to make sense, then I'm not sure what to tell you.
Well, I'm just explaining that secular geologists universally agree today that the strata were formed by water, with the exception of certain things like they believe the Coconino and Navajo sandstone formations, other than sand dunes that we find in the geologic column were formed by wind. But they're wrong about that. But they universally agree that if you point to a given strata, it was created by water. That's the consensus opinion today. They just have a different explanation to it. But as for when it comes to plate tectonics was an idea put forth by a Young Earth Creationist Christian in the early part of the 20th century. That idea came from not secular camp. It was a Young Earth Creationist Christian scientist who first posited plate tectonics.
I'd have to look that up. Obviously, I'm not a geologist, but I'd have to look more into that, because that's really not a strong suit of mine. So I'll take your word for it.
Well, the thing that you have to wonder about how, if the secular geologists believe that portions of the various continents were underwater at this time, and then millions of years later that part rose up because of pressure in the continents and it became exposed out of the sea, and another part was sunk and it was down. If you look at the images they provide for the various stages, the Cretaceous, the Devonian, and prior to those, you'll see that the continents are buried by water in different portions, and that's why they say that they're covered with sedimentary material. But the problem with that is there are what we call mega sequences that exist on the Earth, and such as the Cascasian, the Arisoka, the Zuni, and the Tippecanoe, and the Sauk. These mega sequences are sequences of strata that can be found here. You go 500 miles away, they're still over there. You go 300 miles north, it's there. Go 500 miles northwest, it's still there. And they cover vast portions of the continents, these one on top of the other, mega sequences. These are stacks of geologic strata that are found at different depths in the Earth, and they were formed together. Now, the problem for this idea that one portion of the continent was underwater for, X million years and then rose up and another part went down and it was covered millions of years, that can't be true because of these mega sequences. They cover vast area on the continent, a large portion of the continents. And that can't happen if portion of the continent was undersea and then rose up and the different portion was down below and then rose up. The mega sequences refute that idea. They could have only formed during the flood.
Well, it would make sense if you accept the fact that the notion that continents are over the span of billions and billions and billions, well, on billions and millions of years, that continents are actually moving, and that there are these certain alignment of continents Pangea formations, which has happened, if I recall right, according to some geologists, it's approximated around 7 times. So yes, if the continents are moving, if they are shifting at exponentially slow speeds, it would be possible to have some of these strata formation occur, but I don't see necessarily why that'd be a particular issue.
Well, let me show you a picture of why. What you see here is a picture of a megasequence. This is the Salk limestone, sandstone megasequence. And you can see that it covers a very large portion of the whole North American continent. Now, if the western part of the continent was sunk underwater for millions of years while the rest of it wasn't, and then the middle was for millions of years while the east and west wasn't, and then east was for millions of years while the west and south were, and central weren't, you would not have this mega sequence cover the vast area all the way across the continent. And there are 5 of these laid one on top of the other. So you see, the secular explanation doesn't fit the data, the geologic evidence. Megasequences could not form by these uniformitarianist processes. They indicate during different waves of material that were sloshed over the continents during the Noahic flood, but they can't be explained by uniformitarian geology.
And wouldn't it follow logically that if everything was underwater at one point, that there would only be one megasequence?
That's exactly the problem. And so you can't have these mega sequences as the continents rise and fall incrementally in different pieces and produce these mega sequences. That's exactly the problem.
Sure. So, I mean, would it be possible that these sequences over time separate and distort by either density or mass or elemental composition?
Well, a mega sequence is a series of strata, 5 or 10 of them, that are were laid down one on top of the other. You got shale and sandstone above that, etc. And these materials are believed to have formed together. That's why they're a particular sequence. And then you go above, you find a very similar sequence, and then above it's another sequence, and these sequences were formed together, these series of strata. So secular geologists agree they were formed together. They just can't figure out how the same megasequences can fit into their uniformitarianist geology, and it's a major problem for rising and falling of portions of the continents over time. The flood can explain it, but uniformitarian geology has no mechanism that can explain that.
Okay, about they all formed together thing, I'm not sure if that's true. I'll probably look it up at some point. Do you have a source for that? It'd be nice to kind of get a kind of quick glimpse as to who's saying that, and if they're and if other people seem to agree with this idea.
Well, yeah, I'll give you an article, a link in the side chat, if you like, for this article. You can find many. I mean, you just use your search engine and search for mega sequence. But there's one from the Institute for Creation Research, written by Tim Clary, and you could read that as a way to start learning about them.
Yeah, I'll have to look into it.
And then if I could just jump in there, since there was a bit of a pause there. I think Crispr might have some input too, real quick. And before that, Jeremy, if you want to unmute yourself as well. I know you were messaging me about something you wanted to bring up as well in regards to a confirmed testable prediction based on CPT. And if anyone doesn't know what that stands for, it's catastrophic plate tectonics. Did you want to go ahead and explain that, Jeremy, and then see what Crispr and Immutable have to say in regards to that? You'll have to unmute yourself though, Jeremy.
I think I'll go first though, because it's
okay. You go first,
yeah,
Crispr.
So the mechanism that Neph's looking for is marine transgression regression, which has been which was originally put forward in like the 20s, and this is based on craton formations, which are basically the shield layers. So those tend to be very flat, and those do move uniformly. The problem is that if everything's underwater all at once, you only get one mega sequence all over the entire planet all at once, which is not what we see. The fact that you see these sequences stop anywhere ever on the surface of the Earth means that you did not have a single process happening everywhere on the Earth. So actually the mega sequences, the fact that there are multiple discontinuous ones, is proof positive there was no global flood. It's not evidence for a global flood.
Okay, you can respond to that, Neff, and then we'll have Jeremy make his point a little bit later. Go ahead, Neff.
Well, mega sequences tell us that that portion, whatever portion of the Earth, the continents that they cover, was underwater at that one same time. And when you compare the mega sequences to the depictions provided by the secular camp for the history of the Earth, the history of the continents during the formation of Pangaea and after it split, the topography doesn't match. So you can't merge. The mega sequences do not match their models for the partial inundation and rise of the falling and rising of the continents over vast geologic time.
Yeah, so I mean, they actually do. If you look at these, you can actually map them out. What you have to remember is that there's cycling of all of this. So the areas, since these are large plates, they're associated with the plate. The entire plate rises and falls together. So it's going to be either all underwater or not as a unit. But if there's a global flood, then the entire surface of the Earth is underwater at the same time. So you should have uniform deposition across the entire surface of the Earth, which you do not find.
Well, we find that with the fact that the Earth is covered by an average of 1,800 meters.
But it's not the same kind of
sediments.
sediment. It's different sediments everywhere.
Why shouldn't it be different types of sediments?
No. So what you should see in the case of a global flood, is you should see a single layer with gradient bedding.
Okay, at this point, I'm just going to have to say that I don't think you understand sedimentology very well.
I mean, I can show you. I can show you the articles on. I can show you the articles talking about the processes of mega floods and how those work. And mega floods show a very characteristic reverse gradient deposition. So you have a single layer of reverse gradient deposition with occasional drop stones and things of that sort. And they tend to be very thick without any cross bedding until you get to the very top of the layer, which is at the end of the flood sequence. Right? We know what mega flood sequences look like. We've seen those in the geologic record, but we don't see a single continuous flood sequence across the entire surface of the Earth.
A global flood would not produce a single layer because of a couple of things. Firstly, secular geologists acknowledge that water sorts materials by density and particle size. So it's
that gives you a local floods reverse gradient bed, one layer with gradient bedding.
No, sediments, which moving water, which contains more than one material, automatically sorts those materials by particle size and density
in a gradient.
Okay, and it will separate.
A gradient is only one layer.
Excuse me, please let me finish.
Okay, just let that finish.
They're wrong.
It will separate different types of material one from the other during this sedimentation.
As a gradient, which is one layer.
No, you need to investigate sedimentology.
I have, which is why I know that you're wrong.
What you're saying is not held to by the world's geologists.
It actually is.
No, I'm afraid it's not. You need to investigate sedimentology. No geologist believes that the Earth should be covered if there was a global flood with a single. Layperson evolutionists believe this myth. Secular geologists would not say that because they understand sedimentology produces moving water produces sediments, sorts automatically different types of material based on their density and particle size.
At which point I have to ask, why isn't all of the material sorted by density and particle size? Because
Well,
it's not. We have alternating layers of different particle size. How can you get particle size 1, and then particle size 2, and then particle size 1, particle size 2, and particle size 3, and then a completely different sort of sediment entirely, and then back to that same sort of sediment of a different particle size still, with bedding going in the opposite direction, and then back to the first direction, and then some completely other type of sediment. And this is all going in one layer with no evident correlation between depth and particle size? And you're saying that that's from automatic hydrological sorting?
That's exactly what hydrology does. If you'll go to a secular university geology website and read their articles about sedimentology, you'll see that moving water automatically sorts different types of materials because the grains in different materials have different particle size.
Yes, but that's
for
not
example,
what you see.
For example, that is exactly what the geologic column is. Various bands of different types of material. Now, these images you see here,
alternating. They're alternating.
Supposedly the images you see here are supposedly the geologic history of the continents, according to uniformitarianist geologists. As you can see, portions of the continents were above water during this period of time, and other parts were underwater during this period of time. None of these images match the mega sequences that are found on the Earth. They cannot match. You look at the early Devonian, look at the early Carboniferous, late Carboniferous, the early Triassic, late Triassic, late Jurassic, etc. No portions of the continent, say for example of North America, are underwater or incrementally in a pattern that would allow for the mega sequences to be formed. So, as I said before, the mega sequences tell us that this history of the Earth's continents can't be true. These images don't match the mega sequences. They're contradicted by it.
Yeah, can you go back up to where the Ordovician is?
Let me screen share that.
That's when the Salk sequence was formed.
See, the mega sequence, I can show you the pictures of the mega sequences, and they don't match any
don't have the Ordovician on there.
I don't see it. No, it doesn't.
So if you don't have
separate them that fine.
You don't have the map from the time frame that the sequence was formed in, then of course it's not going to match the maps you're looking at. You have to go to the map from the time frame that the sequence was formed to find matching ocean coverage. That seems pretty obvious to me, right?
It won't match. It won't match. We'll do that.
Find a map to prove that, though.
Yeah. Well, we can do that. So here. That doesn't match. No. The continents of North America are just slivers of a continent at that age.
Yeah, so you have that same partial coverage regions that you were showing when you had those sequences. So this is exactly what we would expect to see.
No, that doesn't match the mega sequences. I'll pull up pictures of the mega sequences for you. All right, this might take a little time. I always find I find it interesting.
Yeah. So I've got both pictures up right now, and they match.
Okay. I'm looking for images of the mega sequences here.
Okay, while you guys are looking at that, I'm going to
Okay.
have Jeremy
So
here.
I've got my screen share going.
Go ahead.
If you, come on, let's go straight. And this is actually from a Creationist website. I just realized that. That's great. Okay, so this is map of the Sauk sandstone, which is one of the mega sequences you were referring to. You can see here's the coverage region, right? And then if I click over here, you can see that that same region is underwater. So it is.
I'm sorry, I'm looking at something. Could you show me that again?
All right, so here's the mega sequence, right? And all the colors.
Yep.
Look back over. Here's what it was like at that time that the mega sequence was formed.
The only thing that is not exposed, that is exposed from the oceans in that image is central United States. Go back to the image.
It's not central United States.
Central and
Canadian
northeast.
field.
Central and northeastern. Now go back to
do you see where my mouse is right now?
Yes. And
This is Alaska. So
right.
This is the very north of Canada.
And all the rest
this is where the Great Lakes are, right here. So what you have here is this Canadian shield, which is running from northern Canada. I don't know the map of Canada well enough to know which province this is, but it comes around here to the Great Lakes, back up around to where Greenland is, kind of wraps around a bit. And now let's go back to the sequence. What do we see? We see, here's that sandstone. All right, what's exposed? Yeah, that's what's exposed is here's this stuff in Canada, right? This is what was exposed before, up and around the Great Lakes, and then up and around to Greenland.
The mega sequence goes all the way down to Mexico and across the southern United States in that image. Now go back to the previous image, and it does not. It goes halfway across, no lower than Chicago.
The
exposed
land that we see. Okay, so look at where my mouse is right now.
I look at the bottom of the exposed part. Do you see that? That's no lower than Chicago, Illinois. But the mega sequence covers the southern United States.
Chicago, Illinois is right about here where my mouse is, right? This is right. So this tip of the Great Lakes right here. Let's go back over, and you can see here's Great Lakes.
All the way down to Mexico.
Not covered. Yeah, you got to realize that the yellow stuff here is the stuff that was underwater in this image, right?
That's the mega sequence.
So this here, right, on this image that's not colored should be green when I flip over to the images. So the green stuff on the next image is this stuff here. So let's focus on Greenland, which is not colored in on this map, so it should be green on the next map.
Let's go to the next image and look at where Mexico is today.
Okay,
the bottom of that is Mexico.
Is right about here.
That's right. The mega sequence doesn't get anywhere near it.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So, right? Yeah.
That doesn't match.
Bottom of the top of Mexico, northern part of Mexico, right here, is hit by the sandstone of the sequence.
It doesn't match.
Yeah, and look,
it doesn't come close to
covering. Realize also that you have this continental shelf, right? The continental shield, which is underwater in a shallow ocean, right? That's what this light blue is.
And it doesn't match the sequence.
And this darker blue here is much deeper water. So let's go over here.
All right, so the exposed part does not match the yellow in that image. You see that?
No, I know the exposed part doesn't match the yellow.
Then it doesn't match.
It shouldn't, because the colored part is the mega sequence.
Exactly.
The mega sequence is from the parts that are underwater, but under shallow water. Okay, so it should be the region lines up with the light blue here, which is this stuff. This stuff here lines up with the stuff that isn't colored on the other image in the north. And then this stuff here, which is deeper water, lines up with the stuff that isn't colored in the south. Let's go back. Here's that same stuff that was exposed in the north, the green on the previous image. And here is the stuff that is deep water on the previous image. Lines up perfectly.
And look at the northern Canada portion too.
This stuff
No,
here?
it doesn't. It doesn't line up perfectly. But look at the yellow at the top of the continent.
Yellow at the top of the continent, right? So we're talking about the stuff that is polar to Greenland, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go back over, and we see right here stuff that's polar to Greenland.
And it doesn't match.
Underwater. This is underwater on this map.
Okay. We're seeing two different things.
Colored.
It doesn't match in my eyes. It seems to in yours.
So, no, I mean, I'm looking at it, and it looks like it's a dead match.
No, they're similar. It's similar, and the reason it's similar is because they write these maps up based on the mega sequences, but the mega sequence doesn't precisely match their maps. There's portions that are inundated in this image here in the Ordovician that doesn't match the sequence, and that's going to be true for all of them. So.
And even
on top of that, you can't even explain the existence of the mega sequence by the land being underwater at one and on an ocean at one time. These strata that make up the mega sequence have clear, distinct boundaries between them, laying flat on top of each other like boards. That kind of sedimentation won't happen under the oceans, where one type of material is laid down and an entirely different type comes along without, without erosion and without gradation between them. If these materials were laid down over a vast age of time, one material would slowly blend into the other. It would be impossible for it to be any other way. There could be no clear, distinct, there is no geologic process in this earth where only one type of material is deposited into the oceans for 15 or 40,000 years. And then for some reason, that material is no longer available for deposition. And now only a new type of material is available for deposition. That would mean the materials on the continents would have to be comprised of different types of material at different heights that are washed off of them, and only those materials would find. We should find what we should find then is that these materials in reverse order match what's in the mega sequences on the ocean floor, and it's not there. So you see, the mega sequence can't be explained by the uniformitarian idea that they were formed under deep water over vast ages of time.
No, they were formed under shallow water.
They couldn't
not
have
deep
been.
Water.
They couldn't have been.
We were
Oceans
just
won't
looking at
deposit
that.
materials.
I was just explaining to you that it was shallow water.
Try understanding this. Ocean deposition will not lay down one material on top of another with a clear, distinct boundary in between them. That doesn't happen in the oceans. What happens in the oceans is materials become mixed by moving water.
Do you remember a few minutes ago when you were talking about the angle of repose for sediment deposition for subaqueous versus subaerial deposition, and you were talking about how it was the wrong angle, right?
Yes.
So that was you saying that exactly the thing you're now saying is impossible is exactly what you see everywhere.
No,
so
I was talking about sand dunes forming under the ocean, which have an inclination of 35 degrees. Sand dunes formed, 15 degrees. Sand dunes formed by aeolian processes, that's wind blown, have an inclination of 35 degrees. The ones found in the geologic column have an inclination of 15 degrees, which tells us they were formed underwater.
Well, I mean, except for, most of the ones in the Grand Canyon, which are...
No, they have a 15-degree inclination. When you find one, the fact that they're not there is an interesting thing.
So the
flat
point
boundaries.
To make there was just that you've just completely gone back on everything you had just said. Because you went from saying that you can't get, you said that you can only get these layers when they're underwater, right? And then you said that you can't get those layers when they're underwater.
No.
Completely reversing yourself.
No, I didn't say that. I'm talking about sand.
And you only changed to that tack when I demonstrated that your previous claim that we can't find it lining up in the maps is completely wrong. So you're not familiar with the geology either in terms of what the historical record was or what the science is in terms of deposition. So I think that this probably covers the stuff that I wanted to add to all of this, unless you want to get into how all of the models of the Noachian flood would have completely sterilized the surface by raising atmospheric temperature to well over boiling point of water. But I think
You've
The
grossly
other panelists
misrepresented.
wanted to talk about catastrophism, so we'll probably get to that then.
You've grossly misrepresented what I said. We were talking about sand dunes forming, the inclination of sand dunes, which form underwater, have an inclination of 15 degrees. Those produced by air, wind-blown processes, aeolian, have 25. And then you move the goalposts from that to sedimentary strata.
So let's be
That's
clear.
not the same. Hold on, please let me finish. I'm responding to what you said. That's not the same thing. You move the goalpost. I said no such thing that contradicts what I said.
Okay,
You misrepresented what I said.
So let's be
you
clear.
tried to argue. Hold on. You tried to argue that when I was talking about sand dunes, I'm talking about sedimentary strata. I told you that sedimentary strata will not form on the ocean floor with clear, distinct boundaries. One material type on top of a different material type with clear, distinct boundaries between them. Only rapidly moving water that's moving in one particular direction will do that. Not the relatively steady, slow flow of water at very low speed, walking speed or something on the ocean floor will never produce sedimentary strata, and yet the continents are covered with it. So that can't have formed under the strata of the geologic column cannot have formed underwater.
It's your fourth time
in the ocean. See.
Okay, so we know what the angle of repose is for subaqueous sediment because we see it happening. So we actually do know that you can, with steady, slow currents in shallow waters, form exactly the type of stuff you're talking about. And if you deny that, then you deny all the stuff you just said about getting this 15 degree versus 34 degree angle of repose.
Can you show me a science paper where a geologist says that water moving at walking speed will create sedimentary strata with clear boundaries? Because no geologists that I know of have ever said any such thing as that. That's completely counter to all the study of hydrology and sedimentology. That doesn't match the science. I don't know where you get this idea, but geologists don't say that. You might believe that, but geologists don't say that. And so I'll ask you the question: what science shows that water moving at such a slow rate as water on the ocean floor will separate materials by particle size and they will have clear, distinct boundaries? What geologic process could provide one type of material only, and then that material stop being available to the environment for deposition, and then only another type of material for thousands of years? Where do you get this idea?
Yeah, so again, these are shallow seas, which means that you have sand, right? And that sand is moved by wind currents very steadily while it is still a shallow sea, which means you get exactly one type of sediment for the extent of time that it is a shallow sea, and it forms very, very consistent, clean layers. Then when the sea level changes, you no longer have that sand because it's no longer underwater. So it's a different type of sediment that's now available, which means you get a different kind of layer, and you get it very, very suddenly, because so long as it's underwater at all, you're still getting the same type of sedimentation.
The amount of time for that material to become exposed would be millions of years. But each type of strata is laid down with clear, distinct boundary on top of it. What you're positing is that a particular strata can form over a period of millions of years and nothing else deposited on it. And only when it becomes exposed will another type of material be deposited on top of it. Where do you get this idea from, geology?
So you have one type of material being deposited while it is a shallow sea. Then, when the sea level changes, it's no longer underwater. It's no longer a shallow sea. How long does it take for the sea level to change by that much? Doesn't take long. And since the sea level change is a continuous process, as long as it is still underwater, it will still be subaqueous deposition. So it is still the same type of sediment until the sea level has changed sufficiently that it is no longer underwater. So you will see, until it is above sea level, the same kind of sedimentation. And then suddenly, when it's no longer underwater, you get an immediate switch because it's either underwater or it's not. So there's an immediate switch from one to the other.
There's a terrible flaw in your thinking here. By your argument, only the bottommost layer in a single layer of material, and the whole geologic column could have been formed under the sea. And then all the strata above it would have been formed by much more rapid deposition than the many millions of years that this was underwater. You're going all over the place. That doesn't even make sense.
I'm sorry. I'm not even sure that I followed what you said, but if what you said was that it's all underwater and you get one type of deposition, which, by the way, one type of deposition doesn't mean one layer, right? It means many layers of the same type.
That's what I asked you. What process in the geology of the Earth on the ocean floor would allow for one material only to be available off the continents to wash into the seas to deposit there, and then after a vast age of time, many thousands of years, that material is no longer available, and the strata deposited directly on it is composed almost uniformly of a different type of material, like clay or shale, and then and only that material is available on the continents. You see, what you're positing is that the sequences of the continents would be in the exact opposite order, and we should find them on the ocean floor. And that's the least of your problems. That's not the case. We don't find the opposite. We don't even find the geologic column on the ocean floor. It's not happening there. Core samples are drilled by oil companies all the times, and they find relatively shallow sedimentary strata on the ocean floors with fossils in them. So your idea of a reverse ordering of the geologic column doesn't work. On top of that, this process couldn't create defined distinct boundaries when material to another. I'm sorry. What you're positing is just ridiculous.
I mean, honestly, I'm not sure I even understand what you mean by reverse ordering. What I'm saying is that you have an area that is underwater, under shallow water, and while it is under shallow water, you have a single type of deposition, because if you deposit the same type of material under different conditions, the layers that you get will be different. You will not get the same layer from the same material under different conditions.
If they were formed under the ocean, where did the materials come from that was washed into the oceans to become sediments? It would have to come off the continents, wouldn't it?
It can either come off the continents, or it can come off of the the loose material that is underwater. So in other words, if you've ever been to a beach, let's say, you will notice that the sand that is just underneath the water surface is not a rock, so it can move around a bit.
Wow, that's a kind of a bizarre thing to think, that materials are going to be at the slow rate of water moving on the ocean floor. You know, we see a stingray lying on the ocean floor, and he covers himself up with sediments, and it settles right down on top of him. And that's pretty much the way it is most places on the ocean floor, relatively slow moving water. And you're going to believe that somehow the waters of the ocean are churning up the materials and then separating them with fine distinct boundaries, clear as a paper thin boundaries, one on top of the other.
You're back to saying
that's bizarre.
You're back to saying that you can't have subaqueous deposition of material.
No, I'm saying it doesn't. Your idea is completely bizarre.
We actually observe subaqueous deposition of material.
Uniform material, right? One uniform material, actually, not numerous layers with fine distinct boundaries between them. That doesn't happen under the ocean.
Actually, funny you should say that. Actually, no, it is multiple layers.
No, I'm afraid that's a very bizarre way of explaining it, and requires a reverse ordering of the continental geologic column on the continents down to the Cambrian, to be found in the ocean floors. It's just not there. That's the most weird idea. It's
so I'm just going to
totally
say this.
weird.
I'm just going to say this because it's really simple. The fact that you didn't know about the two maps that I showed you earlier, and you were instead claiming that there was no way of lining it up with the historical information,
I brought it up.
You're simply not familiar with geology.
Well, I brought it up.
I think that we can move on to whatever our other guests wanted to talk about now.
Okay, yeah, I'm fine with moving to another subject. Sure. I would just say, you know, that the sedimented, the geologic column is comprised of strata which have fine distinct boundaries, different types of material directly upon each other. one type of material, shale, and shale, almost nothing but shale, and then sandstone directly on top of it, and nothing but sand, and then chalk, nothing but chalk,
and then back to shale,
and then clay, and nothing but clay. That process is not going to happen on the ocean floors.
I don't know how you could possibly get shale and then sand and then clay and then sand and then shale and then clay and then sand and then shale and then limestone and then clay and then sand and whatever else it might be in that order under a global flood.
Because water sorts materials by particle size. And
well, if it sorted materials by particle size,
moving
you
water
would not have sand above clay above sand.
Okay, how about if Neff wants to, or if you guys want to have one last point?
No, that's fine. I'm done.
Yeah, I'm happy with it. Yeah,
I had just so we can either do one of two things, because Immutable was supposed to talk a little bit about the age of the Earth, evidence for the age of the Earth, evidence against. But I do have a request for a brief portion on the ordering of the fossils themselves.
Did he leave? Immutable's not here.
Yeah, Immutable had about an hour of discussion in them, and then kind of passed it on to Crispr. But the ordering of the fossils themselves, right, in the fossil record, does that fit more within a global flood related model, or more within a progressive evolutionary model? Like, what would you say there, Neff? And then if Crispr has an objection to that, he can go ahead as well.
Okay. Well, there is a minor order in which we see in the geologic column. It's true that we find typically smaller creatures near the bottom and larger ones at the top, and the evolutionist interprets this as being evolutionary time. But there are lots of out-of-place fossils and bone beds, in fact, that don't match the imagined geologic column of the uniformitarianists. Lots of out-of-place fossils. In fact, there's a whole list of them on Wikipedia you can find, where they find fossils, anomalous fossils. They're not where they should be. Hundreds of them. And so that doesn't match the geologic column according to uniformitarianism. Secondly, you can't get a fossil by vast ages of time. Every fossil is a creature which was buried rapidly. This is why geologists gave up the idea that the strata of the Earth were formed by wind processes in the last century, and came on board with the fact that rapidly moving water is what sorts strata and creates them with their fine distinct boundaries and no erosion between them. So every fossil is a creature which was rapidly buried. The vast majority of them would have been buried alive. And the reason we find this general ordering of smaller to larger is because two things. Firstly, the smaller creatures are unable to move away from advancing floodwaters. The continents weren't just bloosh covered with water all at once. The process was it was fast, but it was relatively slow in a day-to-day basis. It might have taken weeks for several days at least for the continents to be completely inundated by the flood. Water rises up, and when it comes to a crest and there's a low-lying land over it, it rushes over that and rapidly buries the valley. And then it rises until it finds another way to get out, and water heads towards the lowest area, right? So this would can be explained by creatures larger creatures being able to flee rising floodwaters by running away towards higher ground, and many of them would not be found in the geologic column. So also on top of that, there are animal foot tracks that are found in sedimentary strata. This can't be explained by uniformitarian process, because if a creature is walking along in very shallow water, fleeing water that's rising, his footprints are going to get eroded really quick. They're not going to sit there for thousands and thousands of years. Those footprints had to be buried really fast to be preserved by another layer of sediments that came right after, very quickly after that creature was crawling on that mud or sand that left a footprint in the ground. So this is indication of a creature fleeing oncoming floodwaters. So now, when it comes to Cambrian creatures, that we find at the bottom of the geologic column, nearly every phylum of living thing at the bottom of the geologic column in an explosion called the Cambrian explosion. And the reason we find them there is because these are creatures that lived in low-lying areas. They lived in shallow seas, very shallow water, and that's exactly where they would get buried when the flood of Noah came. So I don't see a single problem with the ordering of fossils in the geologic column with the flood. It seems to match what the flood would in fact produce.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for that, Neff. We're going to do two things. We'll allow Crispr to respond to that, and then if Neff has a quick thing to respond back to that as well. I want to welcome Dragon. Drag, thanks for joining us. This should be obviously good. I've got Superbad here who wanted to say a few things, but it seems like his echo and his mic is a little bit off. Am I the only one that can hear that every time he...
Yeah, he needs a headset like sometime soon. I didn't know this was the same dude that's been leaving hilarious comments underneath my videos.
We had to prove to you that it wasn't my sock account, but
no, not this dude, just the other three.
Okay, what we're gonna do with Superbad, with Jeremy here, he does want a few things to say. Jeremy, why don't you try getting your headset on, try fixing up a few things there, then we'll give it a shot again later. Secondly, Crispr, respond to what Neff said there, and then Immutable was supposed to have a portion of discussion relating to evolution. We're gonna have a replacement, a fill-in here with Drag, and we'll have Drag and Neff kind of dialogue in regards to that. So I'll leave it to Crispr. Go ahead.
I got to find the unmute. Firstly, I just want to comment on the hilarious suggestion that the reason we only find the Cambrian animals together is because they were apparently the only things living in shallow water, even though we later find in higher levels we find other shallow water fossils. So I mean that's just kind of a silly thing to have suggested. On to the comment about fossil footprints, there's the really obvious answer, which is that there are these things called mudslides that happen, right? So if you have something walking along a beach where there's a mudslide shortly thereafter, you will have mud covering sand that will actually very, very nicely preserve those footprints, which is how footprints tend to be preserved. And of course, depending on the quality of the preservation, you have some indication of the amount of erosion that happened in between. Final thing that I want to say, and this is really the most important one, which is that, you talk about having smaller things at the bottom and bigger things at the top, but the problem is that you actually have one type of thing throughout, which is these nice little things called coccolithophores, which leave very nice fossils that can be tracked to change over time, and yet they're pretty much the same, right? They have they have no intelligence, any of them, because they're single-celled. They have the same hydrodynamic properties as one another, even though their shells, the coccoliths of this, are different and quantifiably different. And so you have at one depth, you have one type, and then another, 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 as a continuous gradient going all the way up. And that, I'm sorry to say, is completely inconsistent with the conception of all of this happening at the same time. So, yeah, I think that pretty much covers the three things that he really brought up. So, yeah.
You misrepresented what I said. You said that I said only Cambrian fossils are found in the lower strata. I did not say that. I don't. You put words in my mouth. The last time we spoke, you did this numerous times. You put words in my mouth.
No, what I said was
I never said
only the Cambrian fossils are found with other Cambrian fossils.
No, I did not say that, though. You're putting words in my mouth. I said we find the Cambrian fossils in the lowest strata in which we find, and to add to that, I would say in which we find complex body forms.
Right.
So I did not say only. See, so you say you said it's ridiculous that I say we only find. I did not use that language.
Okay. Do we find non-Cambrian fossils mixed in with the Cambrian fossils?
I don't know of any.
Okay,
but I did not say we find only.
So So in the beds where we find Cambrian fossils, we only find Cambrian fossils.
To my knowledge, but I
Okay,
did not
so-
say we only find. It would be it would be certainly anomalous to find something there that was not Cambrian and would not fit uniformitarianism.
The best of your knowledge, in those beds where we find Cambrian fossils, we only find Cambrian fossils, but you're saying that the reason we find those simple fossils there is because they were living in shallow water.
They're not
right?
simple.
Right. Okay. So there were no other simple organisms like, I don't know, like a clam or something, right? Because we don't find clams in the Cambrian fossils. Those are pretty simple organisms that live in shallow water. Where are the clams in the Cambrian beds? They're nowhere to be found, right?
Well, does that mean that? But that doesn't, an absence of a fossil is not a good argument. The fact that we find, and I would correct you about simple. By no means are the Cambrian creatures simple. They are outrageously complex.
Oh, no, I agree. I absolutely agree.
The most complex eyes known to have ever existed on the Earth are found in trilobites.
I think that certainly Anomalocaris is much more complex than a clam. Depending on how you're using the word complex. I mean, some people might use complex in a different way, but I think that in the way that we're using complex in this conversation, Anomalocaris is more complex than the clam. Sure enough, right? And yet, for some reason, Anomalocaris couldn't manage to outswim the clam that's only found at the higher layers.
Well, so that's not a problem for my model. That might be for yours if you believe only everything moves only from simpler. Of course, evolutionists don't believe clams evolved at that time. They believe they evolved later.
Yes, that's why they're not found there.
Because they're not found there. But so it doesn't fit the logic of evolution, though, of simpler to more complex, because clams are not found in the Cambrian. See what I mean? So that really doesn't help you at all.
Simple to more complex.
It's really important to understand that evolution doesn't say that everything simultaneously and exclusively goes from simpler to more complex.
Of course not. No, but here's when it comes to clams, good luck explaining clams 4 feet wide that weigh hundreds of pounds on top of the Andes Mountains with their shells closed. They were buried rapidly. They weren't buried by over thousands of years. On the ocean floor, it takes, for example, chalk forms. Because of the rate of deposition on the ocean floors, 1 to 2 centimeters of chalk is expected to be formed over a period of 1,000 years. 1 to 2 centimeters, that's less than 2 inches for 1,000 years. Now, these clams are several feet tall. They're 2 to 3.5 feet thick vertically. Okay, and their shells are closed. The shell being closed proves they were buried rapidly, and they would have to be buried rapidly to become a fossil. So, because when clams die, their shells automatically open. The muscles relax, it holds them shut, and they open automatically. So these creatures are gigantic clams that were buried rapidly, else they would not be a fossil. And they were on the ocean floor at one time, because now they're on top of the Andes Mountains, which rose out of the waters during the flood, of course. So clams don't match the uniformitarianist idea either, because we have these massive number of clams, large and small, buried rapidly with their shells still closed. But so I would ask you also, if you believe that the vast ages of time explain the geologic column, can you explain to us why we would find a dinosaur in chalk? Because chalk forms on the ocean floor, it's said, at a rate of 1 to 2,000 centimeters per 1,000 years, and yet nearly largely articulated fossils of fish, crabs, lobsters, and even dinosaur bones have been found in chalk. And largely articulated dinosaur fossils found in chalk. Now, and catfish. So how do you get, at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years, enough sediments to cover the animal and then become compacted to squeeze most of the water out? That would take numerous feet more of sediment to cover a creature that's numerous feet thick, like its bones would, even the vertebrae of a dinosaur, which is 6 inches to a foot wide. How does that get buried and remain intact at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years, when a whale, which dies on the ocean floor, will be totally and completely consumed? Nothing will remain, not a smidgen of bone, in less than a year.
Can chalk dissolve in water?
No, the thing is that chalk forms in mostly shallow waters, and mostly forms from the sort of this ooze of dead coccoliths and other algal species, right? And so it takes a very long time for this to actually get compacted, this ooze to get compacted into rock, and so you end up with this thick ooze, right? That is very poorly oxygenated. Something falls into that.
Right. That's the only explanation, is that it had to have fallen into that. But the problem is it increases at a rate of only 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years. How can a fossil remain on the ocean floor over such a period of time, as many thousands of years? And secondly, how do you get a dinosaur out to sea without being completely consumed? Or a crab or a lobster moved out to sea where chalk is forming, which is a couple of 100 miles off the coast, without being completely consumed by scavengers before it even hits ocean.
The La Brea tar pits kind of comes to mind with those scenarios. It'd be the same thing in a different substance.
No, you could. Those two substances are so dramatically different. One can't be likened to the other.
Well, we just talked about how the chalk could be an ooze, and tar is kind of oozy.
But this happens on the ocean floor, though.
Right, and tar and other materials that are denser than water can also exist on the ocean floor.
Tar can be petroleum products can be created by.
I'm talking about petroleum products.
By heat and pressure and rapidly. In fact, that's how they make
petroleum
oil.
But petroleum is a thing that we make that doesn't actually exist in nature.
Do you know what synthetic oil is? So
yes,
right.
Yes, the synthetic part is kind of the giveaway there. So now what you're not understanding is that
you're not answering my question.
I'm trying to, but you're interrupting me. That's kind of the problem here.
So if you have 20 feet of non-compacted ooze, right? That'd fit a small dinosaur, right?
So is that what we see on the ocean floor? That the coccolithophores are 20 feet thick and loosely compacted? Where is that on the ocean floor?
I don't know how thick it is exactly. I'm just giving you a number, but yeah, it's loosely. The ooze is loosely compacted.
That we don't see that anywhere on the Earth.
I mean, that's how things get caught in amber. So I mean, why wouldn't it work the same way in an aqueous environment?
If it's not happening now, why would you believe that 20 feet of coccolithophores would have existed in the past over uniformitarian time if that's not happening today? Because that's not found on the ocean floors. This 20 feet of coccolithophores. You have relatively dense coccolithophores always on the bottom of the sea, and they just get slowly added to at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years. Now that could be explained by the flood, but it can't be explained by uniformitarianism, because a dinosaur or a large tuna fish or even a crab is not going to get washed out to sea hundreds of miles away from the shore, where close to shore, where lobsters live, and then out to the deep sea without being consumed by scavengers before it even settles to the bottom of the sea.
Well, we don't really have to. We don't have to be too concerned about the animal being consumed, because we're more interested in the mineralization of its skeleton.
But it would be, you see. I mean, if you took a boat 20 miles off the coast and you took a 10-pound fish and dropped him, there would be no fish hit the ocean floor. It would be completely consumed by scavengers before it ever hit the ocean floor. But you're talking about believing that dinosaurs and large and fully articulated crabs and lobsters were washed ever so slowly by the oceans out 100, 250, 300 miles off the coast of a continent, and then drops down to the ocean floor, where it gets buried at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years.
I don't remember ever outlining any such scenario. Maybe I should rewind this, where I started outlining any slow movement of any animal at any time, because I could have sworn that I did outline how you have something that's much denser in an aqueous environment, causing an animal to become trapped in it and then killed ultimately and then preserved.
Right. So that happens 200-300 miles off the coast. How did the
can happen? Because they move, because they travel, they migrate like any other animal.
Lobsters live in gyres where there is virtually no oxygen at the ocean floor.
Sure, they can actually be washed out depending on whatever tropical system may be going on at the time. There's a lot of factors as to why animals move to areas that they're not and so inclined to.
So you believe that a lobster can get washed away from the continent, say he's, I don't know, a mile or half a mile off the coast of Maine or something, and then water's going to wash him 100, 250 miles off the coast along the ocean floor, and he's going to be articulated when he comes to a stop and not completely decayed and broken into pieces and gobbled up by scavengers?
So if he's
to remember that
how is that logical, please?
The chalk ooze, the stuff that will be chalk ooze, is actually shallow water, not deep water. So that's
we don't see any 20 feet of chalk ooze. I don't know where you're getting this idea.
Yeah, I'm trying to find an actual number on that.
Yeah.
People don't.
Yeah,
that doesn't seem to be like a major area of concern for most people.
And on top of the absurdity of these ideas is the fact that to even get a massive amount of chalk to form and rapidly enough to bury a creature so that it's articulated in water where there's no oxygen, where that crab, lobster, or dinosaur couldn't have been its environment to live. It just couldn't have lived there. It wouldn't survive. On top of that is the fact that the materials, these coccolithophores, had to have died in massive plumes in order to fall, enough of them fall rapidly enough to bury the creature articulated still, not disarticulated, so that it would form. Now, that could be explained. That could be explained how so many coccolithophores would die so quickly and then settle into the sea, can be explained by the flood of Noah. As the hot waters that were in the earth came rushing out, highly mineralized hot waters came out of the earth, changed the environment of the ocean dramatically, chemically, and changed the temperature of it, and killing massive plumes of quadrillions of coccolithophores rapidly, and which would, when they die, they lose their nitrogen and their oxygen. It seeps out of them, little shells, and they sink because they're no longer buoyant, and they go to the ocean floor. That's how a coccolithophore dies. It loses its gases and it sinks. Okay, so massive plumes of coccolithophores dying because the waters are high temperature and highly mineralized, a bad environment for them that didn't exist before, would explain massive plumes of coccolithophores dying rapidly and then settling to the ocean floor to create a fossil in chalk, an articulated fossil. You can't explain that with uniformitarianism. Over a vast age of time, that's just never going to happen.
Yeah, could I get a reference for this highly mineralized, and what temperature are we talking about again?
Well, the waters coming out along the ocean floor, along the mid-oceanic ridges, are above boiling temperature.
Are you talking about the plumes that come up?
The
hydrothermal vents? Okay.
Yeah, so I finally got the answer. According to drilling core samples from various drilling operations, you don't actually see any cementing of the ooze until below 50 meters.
But it's not 50 meters thick.
So you have 50 meters of ooze.
But it settles at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years.
Yes, it settles at a rate of 1 to 2, right? That's your new addition, right? And at approximately the same rate, you have cementing of the old stuff that's 50 meters down. But you have 50 meters of loose, non-compacted, non-cemented ooze. That is a lot of ooze.
What you mean by ooze is it's not so thick like mud or anything. I think you would be misrepresenting it to call it that. But nonetheless, the rate at which they settle is 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years. You cannot get an ocean an organism to lie on the ocean floor for thousands of years to wait for it to be buried at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years.
Yeah, but
it will be completely consumed. It will be completely consumed. In fact, it will disarticulate because of the action of the salt water dissolving its tissues by itself.
And so I think we both said that it's not going to go and run itself, or excuse me, it's not going to stay there while the ooze covers it. I'm pretty sure we both said that it would actually fall into the ooze.
But the ooze settles at a rate of what you're calling ooze.
Yes, it's not covered by
settles at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years.
It's not covered. It's not covered by new sediment. It's covered by the ooze that is already on the floor.
Yes. Two things I pointed out already. The organism can't remain there for thousands of years waiting for the coccolithophores to encrust and bury it. Because it would be consumed by scavengers and disarticulated by it would be decayed by the action of osmosis from the ocean waters seeping into and out of its tissues. It would completely dissolve. Secondly, you're not going to get a dinosaur or a largely articulated crabs and fish and lobsters that far off the ocean floor with even by moving water without being disarticulated, completely disarticulated and consumed. So that's just not plausible. That's not a believable idea.
Well, so Nephi, do you know that there's a zone actually at the deepest depths of our oceans where there is no life? It is actually, you can see the demarcation between the regular ocean and this area. Scavengers know not to go in there, even to this day. So presumably they would know that there are other creatures there. So why would they try and scavenge for an area that they would know that they'd also get trapped into?
Well, I said
because presumably, because let me finish. You got to talk for like 50,000 minutes. If you're talking about something that's going to be picked off, they too would then be caught in the ooze, the same ooze that the prey is now caught in and can't escape from. Okay. So let's be very clear on the scenario that's being presented and not what you're saying that we're saying. Do you understand our position here?
I've already said, didn't I, that the areas where chalk forms is highly lacks oxygen, so the organism that's not its native environment, right? Secondly, we find it there, so it would have had to have been transported there by water. Now, as I've already said, that's not going to happen and have an articulated creature there for two reasons. Firstly is scavengers are going to gobble it up long before it travels 100 miles. Secondly, the osmosis of the ocean waters would disarticulate the tissues of the fossil before it ever got there. It's not a believable idea. I think it's absurd to believe that a lobster gets washed away from being off the coast, 500 meters or something, from there to 150 miles off the coast of a continent into much deeper waters where there's chalk forming without being completely disarticulated. To believe that, can you tell me why that sounds believable to you?
So as Crispr was actually saying inside, it is buried in the ooze that is already there. You can get deep ooze close to the shore. So you don't need this whole whooshing scenario that you're trying to posit.
Well, again, the sediments, the coccolithophores encrust the ocean floor at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years.
Okay, and we're talking about the ooze that's already there. We're not talking about what's already creeping. We're talking about what already exists there and an animal coming in contact with it.
What you're calling ooze is just a plume of coccolithophores. That's all that is. It's not like
I think you're mistaking what we're calling ooze.
Are you saying that the materials, it wouldn't matter how dense it is. I think it's far less dense than what you're positing. But secondly,
is it less dense than the water that it's in?
How do you get the creature there without being completely disarticulated?
Okay, so have you ever seen an animal trapped in something that's very sticky?
Yes, but I'm not hearing.
So you understand kind of what's going on here, then?
I'm not hearing an explanation as how the organism got out to the ocean without being disarticulated completely.
Okay,
from where it was before.
It fell in near the shore and got caught, and its articulation was based on when it died.
Right, but chalk doesn't form there.
Okay, chalk does form there. We're talking about that ooze that we're talking about was already there.
Chalk doesn't form 50 meters or 300 meters off the coast of a continent. It forms in the deep oceans. It forms at a considerable distance from the continental shore.
Chalk absolutely doesn't form in deep oceans.
Chalk does not form on coastlines.
Okay, we could easily just.
That's ridiculous. What you're having to believe is that a fully articulated creature that weighs anywhere from a pound to hundreds of pounds gets washed way out to the sea, sinks down to the bottom without becoming completely disarticulated, and then buried at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years to explain it as plausible. That's not plausible.
I'll throw out one example.
But if a massive plume of coccolithophores was killed because the ocean's environment changed rapidly because of the flood of Noah, and bajillions, trillions, quadrillions of coccolithophores died at once or in a very brief period of time and then began to settle, that could explain having a creature buried in such a creature found in chalk as a fossil that's largely articulated.
So I'll just toss out one example here. The entire coast of New Zealand, right, all the way up to the coast, is surrounded by exactly the type of ooze that forms chalk, right?
Okay. The materials are not forming at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years at that
not
place.
The new stuff, it's the old stuff. There's 50 meters worth of old stuff at a density of 1.6 grams per cubic centimeter, which is only slightly more than water, and certainly less than the average animal's body density, all the way up to the coast, which means it's easy for an animal to fall off a cliff in New Zealand and sink straight into this ooze.
Why would there be chalk cliffs to begin with then?
1 or 2 grams per cubic meter of water simply means that's a plume of coccolithophores. That doesn't explain them covering the creature at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years. I'm sorry, you haven't provided anything that makes this idea plausible.
Denser than the ooze, so it sinks down through it.
The ooze, what you're calling ooze, you're doing 2 things. You're misrepresenting how dense the coccolithophores are in that water. Secondly, it wouldn't matter if they are remarkably dense. The creature will still be disarticulated at a rate if it sits on the ocean floor for 1 to 2,000 years per 1,000 years per every 1 to 2 centimeters. It will not be there for the time necessary for it to become completely buried. You would have to have coccolithophores not only cover its body, but many feet more of them have settled on top of them and then compacted slowly into a hard material.
I'm gonna
that would take
one
a
more
vast age of time.
This is ridiculous.
That creature is not going to be there over a vast age of time, not 1,000 years.
I'm not sure what's really difficult about this. Nephi, have you ever?
It won't be there for even 15 years, much less 1,000.
Nephi, have you ever put a whole strawberry in a bowl of Cheerios? Like, I'm not sure.
I want to take one more crack at this.
Go for it, man. This is ridiculous.
Right. If you were to go off the coast of New Zealand, all right, immediately off the coast, and swim down to what looked like the bottom, right, and put your hand on what looked like the bottom, you would stick your hand straight through it because that's not sand. That's calcareous ooze. All right. That is an ooze made up of dead coccolithophores and other algal species. They're dead. They've sunk to the bottom, and now they are an ooze that has a density of 1.6 grams per cubic centimeter, which is 60% denser than water, but less dense than the average animal, which means that the average animal, when dead, will sink through this calcareous ooze, which is already on the bottom to a depth of 50 meters.
From how far off the continent? Firstly, how far off the continent from the continental shore is that?
Immediately.
And
secondly, off the coast of New Zealand.
Literally made of a cliff.
Are you telling us that there are no sea creatures living in that area?
Yes, there are sea creatures living in that area, but they don't swim down calcareous ooze.
So a creature that's thicker than as thick as a dinosaur or a fish or a lobster is going to be buried by this stuff. There's no creatures living there. You're saying there's no
buried by it.
What you're telling us is that there are no such thing as scavengers in these areas, and that's ridiculous.
There's no oxygen in the calcareous ooze, so the scavengers can't live in it.
Show us a shoreline of this earth that has no oxygen.
I'm literally screen sharing one of the cliffs right now. Like,
that's
all
material
that white
that's
stuff
been raised up.
I want to see
already
there. That was already there. It was there's no raised up. It was made that like if you go down, what do you think is below that, Nephi? What do you think is below that shoreline?
So what I want to know is,
I mean, you can answer the question, or you could just ignore it.
Well, I was asking a question when you started. Where is this area immediately off the shore of any of this continent where the water is absent of oxygen, nearly is so deprived of oxygen? Where are these places?
Okay, this environment, Nephi, I'm trying to recap.
I'm asking
really easy. I'm not sure who's got a warrant out for their arrest, but
so as I was asking Crispr,
okay, yeah, super Jesus. Okay,
so Crispr,
you.
I was asking you,
So
where these areas off the coast, can you show us where they are so that we can see that this what you're calling this ooze that you believe forms explains chalk formation is an area close to the continents of the earth, but is virtually absent, has the water is virtually deprived of oxygen? Where are these areas again?
Okay, listen, Nephi.
Because see my screen?
That's not the case.
Go ahead, Crispr.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
I just want to make sure. All right. So this is New Zealand, right? We all recognize this is New Zealand, right? Now you see what this blue color here says, right? The Calciferous ooze. This is what we're talking about. And you notice what this says, right? This is the terrigenous sediment, which is around a lot of coasts, but it's not around the coast of New Zealand. On the coast of New Zealand, immediately off the coast, is Calciferous ooze. All right, immediately off the coast, there is no terrigenous sediments at all off the coast of New Zealand, which means that if you're 3 feet off the coast of New Zealand and you go to the bottom, you find the Calciferous ooze.
Okay, not around the continents, though. You see, that's the problem for you. And the chalk, the chalks of England are not. The areas surrounding the continents in white, you see, are not areas that are deprived of oxygen, where chalk is forming at a rate of 1 to 2 centimeters per 1,000 years. So what you're saying refutes yourself.
Well, Nephi, are you saying that the water? Wait, hold on for a second, Christopher. Nephi, are you saying the water in that area is deprived of oxygen?
No, I'm saying it's not. That's the problem.
Okay, that's not what we're saying. That's I thought you were saying that's not what we're. Okay, the Calciferous ooze is anoxic, not the water around it.
You asked a question. Hold on, just let me do this.
No,
you
that's not exactly right.
You asked a question. How can you get? Hold on. You asked a question. How could you get some type of animal buried in chalk? How could you find the fossils articulated, buried in chalk? Well, the way that you find it is that off some coasts, not all coasts, some coasts, you go immediately to Calciferous oozes. Immediately. Now, I'm saying that you won't find articulated fossils from here, areas like this, but you will find it from areas like this,
and
or like that, or like this here off Madagascar, or I think there's a couple of other areas on this map somewhere, but I just don't remember where. But also, these boundaries change over time, so you're going to have more or less different points in time. So yeah, basically, how do you get it buried immediately in chalk? Well, you get it to die from over here and not over here.
Exactly.
That's the answer to your question, exactly as you asked it.
The problem, there's 2 problems with what you're pointing out that refute yourself. Firstly, you're making an exception to the fact that ooze is found around a place that doesn't explain the chalk formations that are found in the central United States, like Nebraska, across the continents, which is true. All the continents of the earth have thick sediments of chalk, and the Dover Cliffs. Those are, okay, you're going to say that that was once deep ocean, but not on the continents and not around. Chalk is not forming presently and around the edges of the continents where you see the white. That's where you're going to find in the cliffs of Dover. You dig through it, you're going to find fish. In Nebraska, you're going to find dinosaur bones. In Nebraska, in the central United States, in thick chalk, a dinosaur bone that weighs many pounds, or a partially articulated dinosaur bone, or a dinosaur skull. in chalk in the central United States. Okay, that had to have been underwater. It had to have been where the water is relatively low, very low in oxygen for the chalk to form. That's why they die, because they get deprived of oxygen, and so they sink. Okay, but what you said a few minutes ago, you misrepresented things. You said there is an ooze that can be found close to the continents, and you used that as an argument to explain things like the fossils of fish, crayfish, lobsters,
I said close to the shore,
that are found in the Dover Cliffs or other chalk formations that are found across the various continents. And that's not what we see. We do not see, chalk does not form in any substantial amount to speak of whatsoever anywhere near the coast of a continent. Okay, so what you provided is an argument against yourself. And you have not answered the question, why do you think it's plausible that an articulated creature will get washed offshore miles into the sea so that it gets to a place, a gyre, for example, where the oxygen is virtually absent and the water is highly deprived, where the coccolithophores will die and form chalk? You haven't even answered that question. What's logical about believing that a lobster is going to get moved 50 miles or 150 miles?
You said you had two things. You've said two things. I'm going to respond now.
Without being disarticulated. Can you answer that question? It's been 30 minutes since I asked it.
Yeah. So firstly, I didn't say you find it off all continents. I said you can find it immediately off the shore, which is true. This is shoreline. I'm pointing to the wrong window. This is shoreline. It's immediately off this shore. I didn't say you could find it off of all. And you say that I'm making an exception. You're the one making the exception, because the rule is not that you find articulated terrestrial skeletons in chalk. That's not the rule.
There's plenty of them found.
Well, there's, New Zealand is a place.
They can't be there under if the creature was formed over a stage of time.
But New Zealand is a real place. Believe it or not, it's called New Zealand.
You're pointing to an exception. That doesn't explain the chalk.
Pointing to an exception.
Articulated fossils found anywhere.
Show me the evidence of dozens and dozens and dozens of articulated terrestrial animal skeletons, fossilized, found in the cliffs of Dover.
Okay.
Can you do that?
I'll be happy to find it, but I want an answer to my question first. I've been asking you for 40 minutes now.
Well, if you're asking
what do you believe is logical about, excuse me, please. What is logical? I've been asking you this question for 40 minutes.
Is this an argument for incredulity, or are you asking for evidence?
What is the logic of believing that an articulated creature that weighs a pound or more, or several pounds at least, will be washed offshore to a distance where the waters are?
Yeah, I don't think that happens. And you have no evidence that it does. So until you present the evidence that you find lots and lots of articulated terrestrial skeletons in the cliffs of Dover, your argument is irrelevant.
For the chalk to form,
you're just lying now.
For the chalk to form, you need inoxidous water. That's where it forms.
The formation of chalk creates the lack of oxygen.
I mean, when did he stop?
I mean, what is anoxic water?
I can't get an answer, can I?
What is?
I did answer it. It doesn't happen. The thing
so how does the creature become?
Doesn't get taken 50 miles off the coast.
Then how does it end up in chalk?
Where you go directly to the calcareous ooze, which is only a few places, but there are places where it goes directly to the calcareous ooze, and that's where you can find those things. Until you can provide evidence that in all of the chalk formations that we see, all of them, we find these articulated terrestrial skeletons, so your entire point is irrelevant. You're just pointing to exceptions.
Chalk does not form close to the continents. It forms in deep.
I didn't say continents. I said shore.
Then
you have terrestrial animals.
It doesn't form on the shores of continents.
Wow.
I didn't say continent. When did I say? I didn't say continent. I said shore.
Let's explain let me show out the absurdity of what you're saying. You're implying that chalk is forming around the shores of continents.
I'm not.
Okay.
Now,
And the
At
creature.
no
you're
point
either,
say
you're either
content.
hold
too
on.
dumb to
Let's
listen
go
or
through
you're
your logic
lying.
because
Which
you're
one is
making
it?
mistakes. Okay.
Okay.
So
See
you're
this?
you
see
you're
this
saying.
black line here?
Okay.
You see this black line?
Listen.
It's shore.
Listen. Let me say something. Okay, we're done talking because you've gotten in your. I'm challenged now, and I can't stop talking over
No,
you.
you're the one who's challenged.
So we're
Okay,
through.
guys,
Okay.
Challenged.
We're through.
Okay.
We're through. I
Sure.
just would point out you were not able to answer my question. You would not for 45 minutes.
Okay. So
Okay, so we're gonna end that topic there.
Yeah.
I want to try and see if
super bad.